I will review. I'll go over everything. Not necessarily correctly, but I will go over everything.
You have to do it in advance.
Maybe. Yes. Okay, come on. Those legs stop. You gotta come back.
Okay.
It's test day. Oh.
I was meeting. I got kicked out of the team. Why? What? What did you do? That's your profile.
Okay, before we get started, a drunken, naked brawl broke out at Disneyland. That, of course it did.
What?
A drunken, naked brawl broke out at Disney World. Two sisters were going to go back to the hotel. They got in a fight over a taxi, and they started beating each other up. Goes to show you.
Give me a kick out of it twice. Give me in it. Our meetings every Tuesday. What is the meeting? Yes.
All right, let's learn, and then we'll talk about the test. The test is tomorrow. I'm looking at the drunken naked fight at Disney World.
Okay.
I need remember the word equality.
I gotta see something really quick. Everyone just wait.
Hey, it's fun.
Stay both of
I'm
them.
trying to give you a pack.
You guys still no.
Okay, who's here today? Good? All right, let's talk a little bit about the test coming up. Let me finish the last little bit about globalization, and then I will review. I'll answer any question you have. I've been waiting all month to do that. What city did they find on the massive silver mine? What city?
Like the real one, or like the imaginary one?
Not the imaginary. The real city of gold. What was the city they found? What was that called? Quick. What was it called? The city where they found all the silver. Okay, city they found all the silver. Where was that? Aztecs was the name of the people of Mexico. Yeah, Potosi. That's where they found the silver, the great silver mine there. Oh, who conquered the Aztecs? Well, the Z's, but yeah. And Pizarro conquered whom? Yeah, the Incas. And so you got at least for the test have to know at least two. Well, one of the essays, your choices will be two of the factors of imperialism. We got through Montezuma, the Incas, inflation, So, did we get to this? Did we get to China?
We got to debt and collateral, but we did not get to China.
Yeah, the thing about China was, so much of that debt's good. First off, they just borrowed money like mad. Spain, Portugal, they borrow. One thing that happens, when people have money, they assume, especially when times are really good, that those good times will last how long? Forever. And so they assume the gold will keep pouring in, and that's where they make really risky decisions. If we use that gold as collateral, borrow. That's part of the reason why Spain will fight all these wars, because they just assume they're going to have money and they'll blow it all.
And they are in debt with most people.
What's that?
And they become debt with the ones they're going to roll with.
Yeah, well, yeah, they'll become like the poor man of Europe almost. Not quite the Ottoman Empire. Ottoman Empire would do the same thing. But they all wanted all this stuff from China. And so all the money poured into Europe bounced around, but pretty soon it's going to be used kind of down the chain to buy goods in China. And by 1600, China would be known as the graveyard of silver. All this silver will end up there. And this is going to be a major issue for European powers. They want that silver back. And they will find something going into the 19th century. At least the British will. Does anybody know what little drug they found? Opium. That's opium. The graveyard of silver. And they'll get it all back. And China has not forgotten that to this day. They still talk about that, the Opium Wars and things like that. So, this is where the Trevor fleet went, but let's talk very briefly about the Columbian Exchange. So the Columbian Exchange, that is going to be the interchange of everything from plants, animals, and disease, and people from the old world to the new world. And yes, there were elements of this before, but nothing like what after Columbus. And this radically changed everything. So this one, I stole this from somebody. I thought this was kind of good. Let's get to all the various things that's going to come. So don't write this down, all this down, obviously, but everything from squash, cocoa, peppers. Can't emphasize enough. Okay, it's weird to think about Italy not having tomatoes, because I can't help but to think of tomato sauce in Italy. It's amazing how fast that took over. Maize, what do we call maize in the United States for the most part? Now, corn is any grain, any plant with a grass plant with a grain. We call it maize. And that corn can grow, maize can grow almost anywhere. But potato is probably the most important.
The Irish did not have potatoes?
That came from the New World. And what's the great thing about potatoes? They grow literally everywhere and anywhere. Now, all you need is a little patch of dirt. How do you plant a potato? You can use potato seeds.
You just
With the eyes
stick it in.
Cut the eye, or you can stick the whole potato in if you want, or cut off where the eye is, drop it in. You make a clone.
That's what we did when we were planting potatoes. We cut the eye and put it on rows.
That's all you got to do. The problem is, it's a clone. And clones are genetically weak and really susceptible to certain fungus. You might have heard of the potato blight. That is a constant problem with potatoes.
Isn't that what happened during the Irish potato famine?
Yep. But you see much of the famine or the threat of famine go away. So those are a few ones. There's a lot. I always think of chocolate coming from Africa. That's what I always think of it as. But it came here and then bounced down. And they found great places to grow it in colonies there. And then here, trinkets, liquor, and of course guns. And then look at all that came this way. Remember the coffee bean, sugar cane. It's hard to think about, here, it's sugar. Well, the sugar cane came from Africa. And so you have this whole exchange. The horse came from Africa and Europe, came this way. So this is all from the old world. Olive, grape, citrus fruit, cattle. Oh, the flu, diphtheria, typhus, whooping cough, measles, malaria. You get the point there? By the way, 2 strains of malaria came. One strain came from kind of Europe. One strain came from sub-Saharan Africa. And the strain from sub-Saharan Africa ravages Africa, but people of sub-Saharan Africa are not as susceptible to this one from Europe. That's kind of a big deal. Have you ever heard of sickle cell anemia? That's probably why there's some related genetic relationship. It's just sub-Saharan Africans. This will be an issue down the road. But to get this point about the Columbian Exchange, disease. In fact, the only major disease that came from the Americas to the New World, or the Old World, was syphilis. And syphilis would ravage. Henry VIII certainly had syphilis. You see all these pictures where their nose will be rotted away by that virus. It really rots the nose away. At least when people didn't have any kind of immunity to it. And so they get these like fake silver noses. A lot of people thought Tycho Brahe, the great astronomer, had syphilis. He just got his nose cut off in a duel. But that's a Columbian Exchange. And pretty soon, all across China, you're going to see potatoes and maize grow. The threat of famine, still obviously a big deal, but will go down. Potatoes, you can live on potatoes. There's enough protein and enough nutrition. You can live on nothing but potatoes.
And ketchup.
Well, obviously. You might not be all that happy if you only have potatoes to live. But that's why tater tots are the perfect food. Yeah.
Slaves were also transported in these two, right?
What's that?
Slaves were.
Yeah, I didn't put that up there. We're going to get the slaves in just 1 second.
Slaves are the one boy from.
Yeah, and we'll get that in 1 second. But also, this is going to be a wave of massive globalization. Who led the exploration that, okay, he didn't make it, but went around the world? Yeah, Magellan. Within years of Magellan making it to what they would call 50 years of the Philippines, there's going to be Spanish treasure fleets sailing across the Pacific. Much to the fury of the Spanish, because these are basically just conquistadors on their own trading with China. And there's going to be international trade. Just overnight, it changed everything. That's why that's such a big deal. Gold from the New World in China, and they're eating potatoes in Vietnam. Yeah.
When was Hawaii discovered?
Hawaii, well, obviously the people who lived there knew it was there, so they didn't have to discover. But the British were the first European explorers, and they arrived in the 18th century. They called it the Sandwich Islands.
Wow.
They named it after a part of Britain. Sandwich. Yes, that's where sandwiches, that's where the name comes from.
Sandwich Island.
So, we're going to jump right to this. So what we have is New Spain. And New Spain involved more than this valley. It's going to be massive. Eventually, New Spain will go all the way up into here. All the way down to Tierra del Fuego. This massive empire. And yes, the people who live there, there'll be a massive revolt near Santa Fe, but this disease so ravaged the American Indian population. And they will get a significant amount of gold and also set up the first sugar plantations. But just a couple things really quick about New Spain. Oops, I thought I had something here. Oh, here we go. So, this royal colony, after the initial loot and pillage, basically it was a smash and grab. You know what a smash and grab is?
Yeah, you smash things, try to grab as much as you can. And
Yeah.
rip it out.
The old story is you go into a window of a store, you smash the window and run.
Oh.
Don't do that. Unless I get my cup. We'll talk about that. I just want my cup.
Are you recording this?
We'll erase that. But also, now I have plausible deniability. Well, actually, first, just taking everything they can. And then how do you make money? There was not as much gold as they thought. Okay, Patati had silver, but not as much gold. And silver was worth about 1/20th the amount, because silver does tarnish. So they set up plantations. And those American Indians that survived, they would be slaves. Okay, not quite slaves. They didn't call them slaves, but they were slaves. But they actually blatantly enslaved American Indians in the Caribbean. But those who survived, and you can imagine how disillusioned they would be, and they would set up they would look to these Europeans like, how are they surviving? And this would help lead to, they actually called this a Council of Indies, and they said the leader would be called a viceroy. As a term we're going to have to know down the road, is a viceroy. And that is a territorial leader. So the Britain will adopt this. So one of the leaders of the various parts of India, viceroy. And eventually we'll have New Spain, and they'll get a separate Peru. Why separate Peru? Peru, Patati. And New Spain will exist all the way until 1820. when there were revolutions all throughout Latin America, and they won their independence all within about a 1.5 year period. From Mexico all the way down to Argentina. And Spain kept a few, like Cuba, Puerto Rico, and what would happen to those colonies?
Wouldn't there be a country called the United States?
Yeah, the U.S. took them and made them U.S. colonies, which Puerto Rico still is. And so, here's a colonial class system. And there's, okay, it's a triangle, but it was not like a nice isosceles triangle. It was more like this. On top of the peninsulars, who were the peninsulars? They were Spanish colonists born in Europe. So they were born there. So you can guess what Creoles were. They were people of Spanish descent, but where were they born?
In the New World.
And there was a kind of a class difference. They considered themselves better than them. Dumb colonists. You saw the same things in the colonies that Britain will form. The British will look down upon British subjects born in, let's say, New York colony. And then you have mestizos and mulattoes. Mestizos are people of mixed ancestry. European and whom? Anyone know? American. European and American. Those are mestizos. So the original Americans and European. Mulattoes are people of European and whom?
African.
African. African. And then, of course, slaves. And Native American Indians, they were considered to be either slaves on a plantation or literal slaves, and then African slaves. Now, I put down black slaves, but there are American Indian slaves and indentured servants. Slaves was not by color. I just put it there to give you the distinction. And we're going to jump right to this. Father Bartholomew de Casas would be he would go there along with the Spanish. In fact, he went there to start a mission and also get wealth. He was going to get rich. But he saw the treatment of American Indians on Hispaniola. And he would write this in a journal. Not that he had a lot of influence. Spanish were not going to continue to quit what they were doing. They're making a lot of money. But it showed that the people of Spain knew what they were doing to the American Indians. He reported stories about enslavement of American Indians. Columbus began what's called the tribute system. And the tribute system said this, because they weren't getting as much gold as they thought. And they kept this going for 50 years. They had these little Hawks bell, it was called. Imagine a little bell about the size of, like a coffee cup, but it was a bell. Every 6 months, every single adult Arawak on Hispaniola, Las Casas talked about this, adult men over 10, so just figure they're old enough to walk, basically, must fill that Hawks bell full of gold. If they do not fill it, what's going to happen to them? They lose a hand. Then another hand. So basically torture them to death. Well, you can imagine what's going to happen. They couldn't find the gold. Las Casas talked about how many would be killed. Hundreds of thousands of Arawaks committed suicide rather than go through the hell of Spanish rule. On top of thousands who would die. There's stories of Spanish seeking, you know what a mastiff is? It's a very big, it was a hunting dog and also, but they were used for fighting dogs. They were used for fighting. They would just stick mastiffs on village and watch them just rip people apart. Could not believe the treatment on the island. He talked about hundreds of thousands of Arawaks dying on Hispaniola. There were as many as 8 million when Columbus arrived, probably. And they were all gone by 1555. The Spanish knew what they were doing, but they kept doing it. So this idea, and you hear this defense by people to this day, oh, it's a different era, and they looked at people differently. Because they made a moral decision. We don't care. We'll justify by saying they're a different religion or different kind of person. We're not the skin color yet. And so, this will trigger this massive globalization. And by going into the 17th century, we have these huge empires, as we did on that map. The Dutch East India Company is going to roll into when the Portuguese broke themselves, they'll roll into here and they'll take Indonesia. That'll be the colony of the Dutch East Indies. And up until the 19th century, it was owned by a company. England will come back to this, will create their own East India Company. And they will literally own India for much of the 19th century, a company. The French are going to take here, Quebec. And so these worldwide empires began to form, and we already mentioned New Spain and Brazil. A couple other spots. You'll notice Africa, just a few spots along the shore. Why? Disease didn't ravage. It would not be till the 19th century and weapons where they could conquer. But eventually Europeans would be kicked out after they left kind of ruin. And so this massive globalization hit. And that's going to lead to the development of international slave trade. Okay, I just put this up to remember. This is a sugar mill in Brazil. So you don't have to write that down, but it's a sugar mill in Brazil. And slaves would work there. Why? The original plantations for sugar would be in Hispaniola, which is Haiti today, Cuba, and Brazil. So sugar came from Africa, would be brought there. Perfect climate, but look at the map. This is actually pretty important. It's not exact, but sugar is grown here to the latitude, sugar grown here to the latitude. The same latitude, grow the same crops. Well, sugar plantations literally chew up people and spit out death. They would work people to death there. And so the problem is, you have these encomienda. If they're going to make money for this plantation, they need to grow sugar. So the first people they tried to enslave were American Indians. So yes, they had encomienda, but the Spanish were doing slave hunting expeditions by 1600 all the way up to Newfoundland, trying to hunt for American Indians. Ponce de Leon. I was a little kid and heard about this conquistador. I did not talk about him here. You might have heard about him. When I was going to remember him, he was looking for the Fountain of Youth. You ever heard of the Fountain of Youth?
Yeah.
And he went to Florida looking for the Fountain of Youth. And there's a couple things in Florida about Ponce de Leon and the Fountain of Youth. They kind of thought there might be a Fountain of Youth. That's not really why he went. He was from Hispaniola. He had an encomienda. And he needed slaves. He was on a slave hunting expedition. Remember I mentioned the soda went through here about the pigs and the disease? Slave hunting expedition. Coronado, slave hunting expedition, barely made. By the way, that's pretty controversial. You go through and all these monuments of Coronado. You can imagine other various tribes that might not be so happy about Coronado. They went all the way to here and all the way down to Argentina looking for slaves. American Indian slaves died of disease, they ran away, they moved the territory, but the Portuguese were going around here. And there was already an established trade for slaves from Africa. They're being traded all through that trade in here. There's a huge population of people of African descent from Iraq. In fact, I was talking to somebody, a former student of mine who was stationed in Iraq in 2005, 2006, and he said, he goes, I had no idea that there are people who are also African living in Iraq. Why? They've been slaves. There's this burgeoning slave trade. Color didn't matter. It was the fact that there was a slave trade. They jumped in. Portugal needed to make money. Spain needed labor. See what happens? They started shipping more. What's the great advantage about African slaves? Where do they run away to? Where do they go? They don't know. They don't speak the language. After the miserable trip across the water, we'll come back to the Middle Passage. They're broken. You put together a bunch of people who don't speak the same language, they can't unify. And there's one more thing. Sub-Saharan Africans are susceptible to the malaria that's here. So they might live a little bit. Some didn't, most of them didn't work in the sugar plantation. But that's also a good point if someone knew the actual products that were wrong. But the big thing is they could be just brought in. They couldn't run away. Now they would. The African slaves would run away. They're going to form a slave kingdom that will last into the 20th century in Brazil, or parts of Guatemala or Belize. In fact, I've been to Belize, and we're going to look at Maya ruins. And we went to a place where they still kind of consider themselves an independent little country within Belize, because they were runaway slaves. which I thought was really cool. By the way, if you get a chance, Belize is really amazing. You know why? Not because it's really cool. Oh, I'm not very frugal, so we do stuff like that. We don't spend money on anything. I haven't eaten in months. No, I literally drive a 31-year-old pickup. I'm very frugal. But it was a British colony. So they all speak English. I speak a little bit of Spanish, but really not Spanish to understand people. And everyone's really friendly there. Of course, I know everyone's friendly. But slave kingdom there. There's a tenth of slave kingdom someplace in the United States and in Louisiana and the Bayou. So they did fight back. But it was not race-based. Everyone got that. It was not race-based. It had nothing to do with color. In fact, the term race or racism did not exist. Oh, sure, people knew there are others with different colors, and there might be a little bit of prejudice in somebody who looks differently, or somebody who looks different than everybody else. Like, oh, there might be something unusual, because humans are like that. But racism did not exist, and it was not because of race. They could justify by being not Christian, and they just wanted labor, and they didn't die. So this is just, well, they didn't die as fast. They'd be chewed up. But that's why the population of Brazil they're mostly of African descent. Jamaica, sugar plantations, 99% of African descent. Cuba, 70% of African descent. Why? Slaves. And so, it wasn't race-based, but, as we mentioned, they have land and no workers. Jump down to this when the sugar planted. I kind of repeated myself. I've also been thinking about it. Soon, anywhere from 12 to 15 million people were brought over. Most would go here or here. Yes, the United States, about 500,000 slaves would be kidnapped and brought over. I should add, most of the slaves here, this is much like what's going to happen in Sumeria, in Rome, or wherever. Why were they enslaved? Why did so many people become enslaved before? What happened? Debt. They were in debt, and they went to pay off the debt. And that's what happened. And so, here's the slave ship. We'll come back to what's called the Middle Passage, a trip from Africa to the New World. This is a position, this is actually the coffin position, and that's kind of shocking how they would bring people over. About a third would die on the trip over. So they would pack as many humans as possible. And this was one way. By the way, why this way? They can't talk to each other. We're going to jump right to here. So, slavery was not permanent. At first, it was basically religious. They say, well, they were Christians or by necessity. Or by origin. They're not from Europe. It was not based upon color. But to stop slave rebellions. Oh, and most died, so there weren't, most died. But there were slave rebellions. So to make sure there were no slave rebellions, every single country that had slaves adopted slave codes. You know the funny in a very dark way? They adopted many of the slave codes from the Roman Empire, then added more. The slavery they developed was not the same as Roman. It was not the same as across Europe. It was not permanent. A lot of slaves would be given their freedom. Their children were not necessarily slaves. But they passed a bunch of slave codes to make sure that the different groups of the lower class would not unify. And how do they divide them? That's when they start dividing them. Please say I put this down. By color of skin. They started dividing people by color of skin and saying some people are more slaves than others. And that is where you get slavery that will develop today. And what came out of this? Racism. Lighter colored skin people did not have to obey the slave codes. The controlled rebellion, justified slavery, and justified imperialism. darker colored skinned people were not civilized, it was argued. Most of the slaves had darker skin. Lighter colored skin had more rights. And so the argument was, you have lighter colored skin. Many people begin to believe they must be better. And by the middle of the 17th century, you're going to see racism. It did not exist until imperialism and slavery. We will come back to this, obviously. So racism as we know it came out of slavery in the New World. And on that, that's where we quit. So let's look at the review list. So I have a bunch of matching from the list, very basic stuff. So everyone take out the review list, and then short IDs. Now, for those of you who don't know, a short ID is a 3 to 4 sentence essay. Pay attention to this, a 3 to 4 sentence essay. And you must give me a brief summary of what it is, an example of it. So 1 or 2 sentences, a summary, an example, and why it's important, what it led to. So like, if I put down the slave trade, it led to racism. Then you have to do 4 of those on this test, okay? 4.
Which one's already started?
I didn't put stars on them this time, but let me tell you which ones they're going to be. Are you ready? Am I ready? Then we got the list, so I can go in order. Okay, let's look at the first column. Humanism will be on there. Renaissance art will be on there. Everyone got that? So I'm going to give you, these are choices. These are choices. Another one will be, I'm looking down the list here, printing press. You must know 2 reasons for exploration. Yeah.
Is it the Renaissance and Reformation?
Yes.
Okay.
2 reasons for exploration. Globalization, and I forgot to write something on here. I put on globalization, but I was thinking the Columbian Exchange that goes along with it. So make sure you know the Columbian Exchange. Make sure you know the Columbian Exchange. In my head, when I wrote down globalization, that was in there. Also, Martin Luther, the 95 Theses, all those church corruptions. Calvinism. So John Calvin, Charles V, Henry VIII, did I say Luther? How about let's add one more? Slavery. Kind of a big one. So these are choices you have to choose for. Slavery. Yeah, short ideas. And then just basic questions for the rest. So let's look at the list. Are there any ones you're not sure about, or then if not, I will quiz you. Yes, Josh. Machiavelli. He wrote The Prince, wrote basically about how to become a successful leader, it is better to be feared than loved, to be a ruthless leader. He's trying to justify the Medici rule in Florence. The Medici, the family in Florence. Any other ones you're not sure about? Yes, Scott. Zwingli. He tried to break up the Reformation and tried to form kind of a religious community in Zurich. We got in a fight with Luther because he said the sacraments weren't really the body and blood of Christ, and so he would be killed fighting against Luther, of course. But he was a big deal because it really set the stage for Calvin. And Calvin would sweep everywhere. Yes, John. The Schmalzig League, that was the Protestant princes, aka Lutheran princes, in the fight against Charles. The Schmalzigs. There's a town. It's right here near Bismarck. Very German place. South of Berlin. Bunch of Prussians. Any other ones? Any other ones? You're ready for the test? You want to just do it now?
No.
Thank you, Reed.
What do you think of classification?
Everything. Yeah, everything. So the thing about humanism is the study of the classics and the idea that no longer is it going to be that medieval idea that only God or what matters to God matters, but also since God made humans be intelligent, we can also make the world in around us and what we do, and that became very important. And so that could lead to everything from civic humanism to do better for the state, the idea of virtue to being a complete person. And this would help contribute to the Reformation, the market revolution. Oh, and Erasmus, in many ways, is the father. Oh, no, I'm sorry, Petrarch. Petrarch's the father. Yeah.
Jesuits?
Oh, the Jesuits. The Jesuits were part of the Counter-Reformation. And so these were Catholic priests who were not only teachers, but they would be sent out as mercenaries, almost like soldiers for the Catholic Church. And so there's going to be a lot of Jesuit missionaries. In fact, a lot of them would follow with the Spanish, and missionaries all along like the coast of Florida down here to bring missionary activity. Basically, a lot of Americans are like, I want to join this church. See the same thing in the Philippines. Yeah. Is there another one? Any other ones? I'll be glad to answer. Yes. So the thing about nation states is the development of modern states in Europe that big enough to build an army, be involved in the arms race. Think about the arms race, that's gunpowder, cannon, and collect taxes, build empires. So that was one of the big causes of imperialism. Yes?
Active supremacy.
Active supremacy, that is one that said that Elizabeth would be Queen of England and a Protestant queen. And not only Protestant, but the supremacy of the Church of England, not the Catholic Church. Is there another one? Any other one? Well, let me list off a couple things really quick. Any questions? Any more? Look through it one more time. Who would write Utopia than be executed by the king? Thomas More. Everyone see Thomas More? What was oh yeah.
I was just gonna ask like Wolsey and Thomas Cranmer.
So Wolsey. Now Wolsey would be he'd be a cardinal and one of Henry VIII's advisors. And he was the one at first resisted the idea of divorcing the Queen, Queen Catherine. He would be executed. Cranmer would step in and say, let's break away and form our own church and set up the Common Book of Prayer. That would set the stage for the Church of England. He would be executed by Queen Mary. Where was Luther branded a heretic? Where or what? What event in what city? Yeah. Of Worms. The Diet of Worms.
Yeah, he was having a diet of worms.
Who were the people who were very radical, thought you could not decide about your faith until you were an adult? They thought be very egalitarian and seemed as a real threat, and they're going to be brutally massacred in Münster. Yeah, those are the Anabaptists. Who would, what is coming out of the printing press? The developments of a common language for people. Yeah. Yeah, the vernacular. And, oh, who did that School of Venice? And he was a friend and kind of competitor, but a friend of Michelangelo. School of Venice, and really began this, really started to perfect drawing children the way they look. Who is that? Yeah, Raphael. Speaking of Michelangelo, what is his most famous painting? Yeah, the Sistine Chapter. The Sistine Chapter. Also David, but that's another one. Who was the first one to sail around Wyoming? Magellan went around. I guess Magellan kind of did go around Wyoming.
You did.
Oh, you mean?
Who was the first one to go make it to the tip of Africa and convince Portugal, hey, we have a route here? Who? The Gama made it all the way to India. Who made it to the tip of Africa? Yeah, Diaz. I know we got a lot of D's. We got Magellan, Columbus. Who were soldiers of fortune? Yes. And who was the Christian humanist from the Netherlands who critique of the church would help in many ways trigger Luther? Good guess. Calvin was a teacher, but he came a little bit after. Who? Petrarch's more humanism. I know, we got all the names start sounding the same, we're not used to it. Yeah. Erasmus, yeah. Erasmus. And then finding it. Oh, who did the Mona Lisa?
Da Vinci.
Yep, Da Vinci. What is this? Who wrote The Prince? Machiavelli, yes.
Are these mercenaries or professional soldiers?
Yeah, the concept of a professional soldier, you know, they were, some of them were what you consider knights or men at arms, but they were mercenaries. I mean, they were supposedly fighting for Spain, but they were for themselves. But Spain let them do it. It was a way to do it on the cheap. Let them go, and we'll collect the wealth. What said princes in what is now Germany could decide their own religion after Charles V kind of threw his hand up? Yeah, the Peace of Augsburg. We are ready. You guys are going to nail this. I still think we ought to do it now.
No.
What were Greek and Roman literature?
The classics?
Yeah, the classics. And what city, Toscanelli would make his map because he had in contact somebody from what city? Yeah, Constantinople. That was a very popular song in the early 20th century. And then would become popular again at the end of the 20th century. They Might Be Giants had a kind of a minor little hit with that.
It's Istanbul, not Constantinople. Istanbul, not Constantinople.
And, don't look at it. Don't look. Look at me. Who would be best? Who infuriated Luther by selling a path into heaven? What person? With the Catholic Church, remember the name? Name? Begins with a T.
Yeah, I'm technically looking at you.
Huh? The Thomas More wrote Utopia. I know we got all these T's. Tetzel. Johann Tetzel.
Wait, who?
He would go and sell off indulgences.
Oh, John Tetzel.
Yeah. We got Prince. Prince Heli was Prince Heli. Who was Prince Heli and how tall was he?
What?
Prince Henry. Not only wanted to fight crusades, he would lead the effort to go around what? He's Portugal, so
We'll be right now.
Africa or Wyoming, either one. Prince Henry.
Jordan, I was thinking of King Henry.
We got, what kind of government did most of the city-states of Italy have, at least during the Renaissance? What do we call it? Government by representation.
Civic Union.
Republic. Democracy implies, a true democracy, everyone decides everything, but democracy, at least to our context, means that people decide. Any other questions? Are we ready for the test?
No.
Okay, clear test. You can get done in 7 minutes. I think I have 34, just because it worked out that way, matching.
Okay,
For most are really basic, I always read, but then the short IDs, that's gonna be the bulk of the score. So make sure you have what it led to. You know, Martin Luther is gonna lead to the Reformation, religious wars. Then you think about humanism, an entirely new way of thought. Renaissance art will lead to perspective, to maps. You know, Charles V to Spain with all this empire, holy wars, and you go broke. By the way, what pastry is going to come out of the Ottoman second siege of Austria,
What?
of Vienna? The croissant.
Are you serious? The croissant?
It was a pastry design on the Ottoman flag, which is a crescent moon. So everyone thinks croissants are French? No, they're Austrian. Who would like croissant then? Okay, Christian's gonna make croissants. I. I'll bring croissants. Yes.
Whatever happened to Martin Luther after the whole Protestant Reformation?
He'd be involved in the 5 Great Revolutions of French Canada. He died exactly relatively wealthy. Yeah. Very honoring to the end. All right then. Test tomorrow.
September